shall find her side. We have come, the world awaketh, its tears have been watered. We have come, straightening our path through the blood of the slaughtered. Out from the gloomy past, you'll never stand at last. Where the white wing above the star is cast. God of our ears, God of our silent tears, thou who has brought us thus far on the way, thou who hast bowed our night, led us through the light, keep us forever through the path we rest our feet, stray from the places our God where we met thee, lest our past triumph with the world we met thee. Shadow beneath thy hand, may we forever stand, true to our God, true to our native land.
Good afternoon, everyone. Both to our virtual participants and our participants in Sanctuary, we just want to let you know how glad we at Calvary are to be able to host this year's MLK commemorative speech. We are very excited for this opportunity for community and church to come together for this event, and we are so thrilled to have Dante Stewart joining us. I want to take a moment and introduce you to our two participants for the day, and I will start by introducing you to our moderator, Minister Lindsay Black. Minister Lindsay Black is an associate minister here at the Calvary Baptist Church. As a proud native Ohioan, she earned a BA in Early Childhood Development from the University of Dayton. Lindsay has been called to the pastoral ministry, and she is also a student at Northeastern Theological Seminary. She is particularly interested in the intersection between social justice and Christianity, a topic which she recently addressed in an interview with Gary Stewart of All Things Equal. Now for our speaker. Dante Stewart is a writer and speaker whose voice has been featured on CNN, The Washington Post, Christianity Today, Sojourners, The Witness, a Black Christian collective, Comment Magazine, and more. He is the author of the debut memoir, Shoutin' in the Fire. As an up-and-coming voice, he writes and speaks into areas of race, religion, and politics. He received his BA in sociology from Clemson University. He is currently studying at the Candler School of Theology at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. So please join me in welcoming Dante Stewart and Minister Lindsay Black.
thanks for joining us this afternoon, Dante. It's a pleasure to meet you, and I read your book, and I'm excited to talk a little bit about it.
Likewise, likewise. And thank you so much to all of you who are joining us in here today and online. I'm just so grateful to be with you today.
Yeah, so let's start this conversation. So you start out shouting in the fire with this question: Can I be Black, Christian, and American? And so I'm curious if you could talk to us a little bit about: is there an intersectionality to these identities, or are they all separate things as Black people here in America?
Yeah, I think for me, especially as I thought about the writing of my book and even the question, it grew out of 2016 when Alton Sterling and Philando Castile were both murdered. Um, I was not on. Okay.
Okay, whoa, okay, yo. I do apologize to those online. I know y'all was wondering, like, oh man, what's going on with the audio? And let me get comfortable because this is just like, let me. All right, so this is how I usually do this. So the question being Black, American, and Christian, which is central to so much of my work, starts with the murder of Alton Sterling and then the murder of Philando Castile. And at that very moment, I was somebody who was young and Black in a white evangelical church at that moment. I was preaching, teaching, and leading, and was really faced with the challenges of what it meant to be in that space and assimilate to white space as a young Black man with my family, but also to be weaponized in that space as a young Black man with my family. And it seemed to be that that weapon was always used against us as Black people, either to silence us or to erase us. So being young and Black in this white Christian space, you learn how to perform in a sense. You learn how to perform to escape many of the ways in which Blackness is sinful or a distraction, or it just is something that is not desired. And so before even that question was central to my own work. I mean, that question is central to Christian history. So much of race and religion, as James Baldwin would say in one of his final essays entitled In Search of a Majority, he says that race and religion are so woven together that to talk about one must talk about the other. I mean, when we look in history, especially in the 16th to 17th century, and this expansion of European colonialism. So much of it was not just Europeans believing that that Black people were products and chattel, but they believed that God was the one who gave them the divine right. And that story, that myth, that story of white supremacy is a story that gave so much of Christian tradition meaning and power. And even as we see in the time of enslavement on the soil, so much of whether you're talking about the catechisms or whether you're talking about when the enslaved preachers would come to town and preach sermons to other Black people. They could only do so insofar to keep this plantation system upheld, particularly by religious and moral justification. And then that story goes all throughout history from then on in so many ways, and even beyond just simply America, but in the diaspora, that race and religion has always been as important to the conversation about religion as its doctrine. And so for me, as I started to uncover that, especially regarding death and dealing with those deaths, and particularly dealing with what it meant to be in a white church during the Donald Trump moment, that's when I started to really wrestle with that question, but particularly wrestle with the ways in which, like, I had become someone who was either oblivious to the questions of race and religion or had run from them. And when that happened regarding Donald Trump and those deaths and trying to process it, and even the response of hostility and apathy, I needed to find a way forward. And so, being in that space, you either stay and you're angry, or you stay and you assimilate, or you leave and try to journey into to that messy kind of alternative way of being in the world that tries to imagine better for your faith, tries to imagine better for yourself, tries to figure out how to develop better voices as it relates to how you understand your Christianity. And for me, one cannot think about better in our faith without thinking about the ways in which our faith has been racialized to its detriment, but then the ways in which we black folk continually over and over again take what this world gives us and turn it black. So you give us the pig, the hog in the country on the plantation, and we turn oxtails into fine dining. We turn pig feet into a yearly meal to remind you of a metaphor of prosperity and love and family. We take a washboard, as my daddy did. We take a washboard and a clothes hanger, and we turn a washboard and a clothes hanger into an instrument. And we take whatever it is that we have been given, both outside of ourselves and inside of ourselves, and we turn it into something beautiful. And so for me, the whole question of race and religion and Christianity meant leaning into not just simply what white Christians had done, but particularly the worlds in which we black folk have made.
Thank you for that. And a follow-up question, you talked about this weaponizing of Jesus. So how do we de-weaponize Jesus in black spaces that have kind of, bought into white supremacy, but also how do we, de-weaponize Jesus in white spaces which are attempting to be colorblind in this world?
I mean, that's a great question, and I think there's a question that so many people are asking: is how do you imagine a Jesus that doesn't, in some sense, need to win a war in order to feel like he's worthy? And so, for me, I think the kind of one of the main things is taking on those better voices. So when I left the white church, I was raised Black Pentecostal. There's a little bit in my story. I was raised Black Pentecostal, and so much of the world I was raised in, it reminds me of that scene of Good Times, right? Any Good Times fans? Yeah. There's a scene in Good Times where a young brother was with his mother, and you see this picture of Black Jesus on the wall. And there's this whole kind of bumping heads about Jesus. And then she says, well, he's like, well, I can't have Black Jesus. She's like, well, that's the only Jesus I've known. And so for many of for so many of our spaces, particularly Black spaces that we grew up in, I mean, this idea of white Jesus is oftentimes, for many of us, the only Jesus we have ever known. But that Jesus, that white Jesus, has a story that is wrapped up in that representation. That's not the Jesus that came from us. That's not the Jesus that we encountered, but oftentimes that was the Jesus that was forced upon us. So in order for us to kind of weaponize Jesus, then we have to both dismantle the ways in which theology and whiteness are so bound together. And we have to decolonize, to use the language of M. Sean Copeland or others. We have to decolonize our theology. And what that mainly means is that we have to take on better ways of thinking about faith and religion. So much of our faith and so much of just story in general, and just many faiths and just in general, is rooted in metaphor and story. And so we as people, we take on these metaphors, whether we're thinking about disciples or onward Christian soldiers. These metaphors have meanings that's wrapped up into it. So if I believe that my faith, at the heart of my faith, is being a warrior, if at the heart of my faith, my understanding of myself and my faith is about warfare, then I will utilize my faith always as a weapon and create enemies rather than friends. And when you wrap Jesus up within that, then you get a whole faith system and a faith structure that just simply is concerned about power and control rather than love and liberation. And so this is not simply in white spaces. This is in black spaces as well, especially when you're talking about patriarchy and sexism and misogyny, and homophobia and transphobia. So in order to imagine better for ourselves, we have to take on better voices. You know, I was reminded of a story this morning. As I was doing my devotion time, I was in 1 Samuel 10, and Saul is anointed king, and then the Bible says, you know, that you've been anointed king, and then you're gonna go to Rachel's tomb, then you're gonna go to the oak at Tabor, then you're gonna go to the Philistine fort, and you're gonna meet people along the way. They're gonna be in a prophetic frenzy, and you're gonna be caught up in that prophetic frenzy as well. Then it says, when all of this happened, it is gonna be like you are a different person. So you are anointed. You have this calling on your life. You have this calling, and the particular calling was that you are there to liberate the people from their enemies. This whole work of liberating our minds and liberating our bodies, but you can't get there unless you go back to the land of your ancestors, unless you go to the Oak of Tabor, which is a cultural artifact that gives you and your people meaning. Or you can't experience that unless you go and meet people who have different perspectives as you, different experiences. And when all that happened, then and only then will it be like you are a different person. So I think for us to kind of de-weaponize Jesus, we have to be those type of people who lean on different voices, who take on different perspectives, who understand at the heart of our faith is a Jesus who says that the enemy comes to steal, kill, and destroy, but I have come to give you life. And if that faith, if that understanding of Jesus does not bring life, particularly to those who have oftentimes been erased and marginalized, if at the heart of our faith that is not it, then we need to kind of reimagine what that faith is and take on different voices. And I'm thinking particularly in my own story, so much of my understanding and broadening my understanding of Jesus has been through woman in scholarship, whether it be M. Sean Copeland, Katie Cannon, Emily Towns, so many of these black women who saw the ways in which black theologians, black male theologians, didn't necessarily take into account the fullness of liberation, but only simply their benefit. Black women was like, no, we got to rethink this thing. We can't just be liberated. We can't just want black males liberated, but we have to think about liberation for all of us in wholeness. And unless we take on those different voices and decenter those dominant voices in ways that are harmful, then we won't imagine better, and we won't de-weaponize a Jesus that is just destroying so many people.
Yeah, thank you so much for that response. It reminds me of some things that you kind of talk about and touch on in the book, especially as you said, just expanding your horizons, right? And I think that I would ask you the question: do you feel like your time in the white church like really opened your eyes to this reality that you had kind of already seen? I know you talk about this in your book where you're shot at by a white man while you're with your brothers, and you are stopped by a police officer for driving while black. So you've had these very visceral experiences of what it means to be black in America, and then you find yourself in white church. Did that open your eyes to the true reality of what it means for everyone to be black in America? Was it more than just, okay, this isn't just my experience as someone who's been stopped or someone who's experienced this, but this is how people see all of black people?
Yeah, facts. I think for me, I was even oblivious. So being raised in the Black rural South, I mean, my family members, they taught us, you know, about like this world. They gave us the story of like, yo, this is like my mama, like this is what you do when you're in this situation. This is what you do when you're in that situation, or you know, be aware of this. So as young children, growing up in the Black rural South, we were aware of so much of the ways in which like anti-blackness was a actual dominant legal structure within our society. It was an actual structure that was woven into so many institutions in our society. And so I think, as they gave us these kind of lessons that we caught, these lessons that we were both taught, but that we also caught, they were trying to protect us. But they didn't necessarily help us like actually interpret those experiences. They taught us how to survive them. And we don't just need to learn how to survive those experiences. We need to learn how to interpret them as well so that we can resist them and change them. There's something there's a difference between this cop stopping me when I'm in college, and then me being a college student trying to use my athletics as a way to bring voice to what's happening inside of our society. Now, of course, this is much different post Colin Kaepernick. You have young college athletes who are out on the street, who are in communities, who are engaged in civic and social action, who are utilizing their voice. But when I was coming through, I mean, it was just for us. It's like, yo, let me go ball out. I'm going to the league and things like that. And it's like the whole kind of statement, don't come back home because there's nothing for you here. So it meant wherever you go, you need to survive and be successful. And so during those moments when that shooting happened, and even when the cop stopped me, and even when Alton Sterling Philando was murdered, I mean, I knew what it meant to be black because I was raised in a black world. My mom would make sure that we would go to the museum. She would make sure that Alice Walker, Margaret Walker, Toni Morrison would be sitting around in the house. And so the house was not just full of black smells and the smells of blackness and the kind of sounds of blackness and just this kind of black world and what it meant to be black and to love ourselves. But oftentimes it wasn't just filled with that, but oftentimes it was filled with trying to protect us and keep us away from it. And so when I think about those experiences, it wasn't you need to make sure you actually, okay, this is what happened. This is what you need to do in response to that happen. It was more like, okay, this happened, you survived, now go on and move on with it. And so when I think about when the kind of connection to this kind of larger black story, I didn't really have that until I left the white church. Studies suggest, and I think this was in the Pew Research survey, studies suggest that when you're black in white space, the more you're assimilated to white social space, the less you identify with the people you come from. The more you identify with white space and in that space, the more you individualize your racial identity. And so whenever we go into these spaces, oftentimes we don't think about what we lose in the process and what we have to give up. And so then that first chapter of the book is entitled Wages for a Reason, because to be black in the white space, there's always a cost and there's always a price to pay. I don't care if you're in a conservative space, if you're in a progressive space, I don't care where you are. Oftentimes these spaces have not been built for us, and it would take us teaching and doing all these things and doing all these initiatives just simply so people can see us as human. And we rarely realize that, what we're giving up is actually tending to the garden that is ours. To use the words of Alice Walker, our mother's gardens or our father's gardens. We oftentimes are, just thinking about, how can I teach people and things like that, rather than, okay, I need to figure out how to care for us in this situation. And it wasn't until I left the white space that I started to understand, this was not just individualized experiences, but this was a long enduring history. And it didn't happen until I read the likes of Martin Luther King, Martin's Where Do We Go From Here? And then when I read James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time, I joke with my friends about when we talk about leaving white churches. I said, it's almost impossible to read James Baldwin and stay in white churches. It's almost impossible to read The Fire Next Time and say, that everything is okay, or to actually, really deal with what it means to try and change this kind of racialized experience that we are in. But yeah, I really didn't kind of think about myself within a larger black reality until really, I left that white space.
Thanks for that. And it's very eye opening to think about blackness compared to the collective idea of what is blackness and how we really kind of see that together. And you brought up James Baldwin, and I loved when you know, were talking about leaving the white church, and a friend asked you, like, well, what radicalized you? And you say, Jesus and James Baldwin. So can you share more with us? What is it about Jesus's faith, Jesus's love for other people, and James Baldwin's love for other people that really helped radicalize your faith and your idea of how I want to share this with the world?
That's an incredible question. It actually is my favorite question to answer. Whenever people start talking about Baldwin and Jesus, so much of my work right now is trying to look at Black literature as sacred texts. So when we as religious people look at our sacred stories and our sacred texts, what we are oftentimes doing is looking at the lives of people who have come before us to develop something in the present that will give us meaning, that will root us and ground us in tradition, that would give us the type of frameworks to understand this world. Whether you're talking about Black people singing Negro spirituals, whether you're talking about the Quran, whether you're talking about Hadith, whether you're talking about this kind of midrash, the midrash and the traditions of this kind of sanctified imagination of interpretation and playing with the text. We're leaning on these stories and these traditions to help us and guide us in these moments. And when I started to think about the Bible, for I deal in the world of the Bible, and I love the Bible. When I started to think about the Bible, I said, you know, I'm leaning on the story of Nehemiah. And he's a man. He's a dude. He just like me. I'm leaning on Esther, and I'm leaning on the story of Deborah, the judge, and leaning on the story of Jesus, and leaning on the story of Paul, and leaning on the story of Saul, and all these incredible people, leaning on the story of Huldah, the prophet, or the prophetess Anna in the Christian scriptures. And I'm saying, we're developing meaning simply from somebody else's life and their experience with God. And it's the same way when we, particularly Black folk, we sit around the table talking to grandma and talking to granddaddy, and they start telling us about how they made it over. They're doing the same thing. What they're saying and what we are saying is that we're listening intently enough for in their story for something that God is doing in their life. And I'm just willing to believe that, you know, that God is not done speaking. That if God spoke in the life of Nehemiah and in Jeremiah, then there is something in the book of James Baldwin that God wants to speak to me as well. There's something in the book of Toni Morrison, in the canon of Morrison, and Toni Cade Bambara and June Jordan that God wants to speak to me. Who could deny when Baby Suggs is in the field dancing in the clearing and telling Black people to love your flesh, and that not be the same way that Jesus tells us to love one another? Who can deny when Baldwin talks about the beauty of Black life, and he asks that question at the end of The Fire Next Time, when he says when he looked at those hallways and looked at his friends, he wondered in his mind, what will happen to all that beauty? That is just like the earth is the Lord and the fullness thereof and all that dwells within it. It is something about paying attention to this world. And so for me, I started to read Black literature the same way I started to read scripture. I started to read it as not just a book of rules, as people would say, but a book of stories that God wants to speak through. And so when I think about Baldwin and even the ways in which Baldwin thought about the church, both the Black church and the white church, Baldwin, he had so much to say about theology. And Jesus, when Jesus comes and he tells them that, yo, you have heard it said, but I say to you, and he kind of reorients and redirects their faith, what Jesus is simply telling them that your faith may be public, but it can also be problematic. And so Baldwin, when Baldwin is in the fire next time, and he says that people ought to love the Lord, not because they're afraid to go to hell, because they love God. And that oftentimes when we left the church, love stayed at the door. That is the same thing when Jesus is saying, you have heard it said, but I say to you, you're going to have to redirect and reimagine your faith. But then Baldwin would say that if the concept of God has any validity or any use, it only is to make us larger and more beautiful and more free. And if God cannot do this, then it's time for us to get rid of him. And it's the same way that when Jesus is on the scene, and even with the prophets, they're always trying to critique the terrible ways we practice our faith and open up alternative ways for us to practice better. And so when I just think about like black literature and Baldwin and Jesus and James Baldwin, I just see that connection there. And for me, it allows me to center my faith on black people as a starting point. Because in theology, if you look at these curriculums and you think about these curriculums in school, oftentimes black theology, womanist theology, queer theology, all these theologies are called contextual, and whiteness is just theology. And so whenever we believe that these theologies are just textual or just footnotes in the story, what we're doing is upholding the white supremacist lie that white people are the center of the faith, and whiteness, as the Bible would say, is next to godliness. You know how that phrase, cleanliness, is next to godliness. So one of the things that to center James Baldwin, black literature and black art and people out of the black arts movement, and just images and things like that as serious ways to think about God and faith and embodiment, it allows me to decenter, but it also allows me alternatives. And I think one of the things in so many of our faith in general, not just Christianity, but in general, is like one of the things that happens in our faith when we go through this woundedness and we deal with the terrible ways other people practice our faith is that oftentimes we become bitter because we're constantly reminded of who they are and what they've done. And we're oftentimes bitter because there are no alternatives. And for me, the only reason why so much of my life is not centered just simply on resisting whiteness or changing whiteness or convincing whiteness is because I found an alternative. And in the voice of Morrison and Baldwin and Barbara and Jordan and James Cone and Katie Cannon and all these incredible voices, or like my grandma and my granddaddy and my aunties and my uncles, to listen to them, to listen to our music, is to, in some sense, say that there is a world here to be explored. I left that world behind. And yes, that happened to me. And yes, I was in there for a moment, but then I have changed. So as Octavia would say in the parable of the sower, God has changed.
Yeah, and so I'm curious if you can share, thinking about this idea of change and this idea of embracing black stories as theology. What does home mean for you? You talk about this in the book and finding, your home church, and then finding home in the white church, and trying to, recreate this. And now you have a wife and your own children. So what does home mean for you from a space of faith?
Yeah. You know, it's funny. I literally was given an interview last night with Tracy Gidges on her book, Black Joy, and I asked her that same exact question. And she was like, oh, no, how am I going to answer it? And now I get asked this question. I'm like, how am I going to answer this question? I just asked Tracy this question, and now I got to answer it. And so I think for me, home and trying to find a home is especially in my own faith, is realizing that, it is the willingness to kind of reinvent myself. And Tracy uses this language of reinvention or redefinition. And as I think about my own story, oftentimes we can convince ourselves that a place is home until we actually deal with what's actually in the house. Oftentimes we can say, okay, somewhere is home, but then when we actually pay attention to what's in the house, we see things that we may not have seen because we were so enamored with the possibility of being somewhere different. And so when we are enamored with the possibility of being somewhere different, oftentimes we don't pay attention to, like, okay, this person does this or responds this way, or this person does that and responds this way. And so until we kind of get some distance from these spaces, then we understand, like, okay, this is the limitation of this space. This is the good. And if I'm in a space that oftentimes I'm marginalized in, we're always kind of negotiating our humanity so that for comfort, so we can reach a certain sort of type of social equilibrium. So, like, to be in this, like, particularly in the white space, like, I learned bluegrass music, like, and things like this. I learned CCM, to just kind of fit into this space, even though there was a part of it that was foreign. But then over time, it became a part of mine, and even today, a part of ours, because even with so much gospel music, this, you see a blend between, like, gospel and CCM and things like that. But then, like, when I thought about leaving and saw the space for what it is, I realized that, that home for me, it almost feels elusive in a sense. And I don't want to think about home per se as a geography, but I want to think about home as a group of people. So me finding home is taking those voices wherever I go and not losing myself in the process. So when I write in my book, when I leave the white church, so much of the rest of my book, so that my story of being black at in a white space at Clemson, and then in California, and then in Georgia, is like the first couple chapters of the book. But the majority of my book is trying to find my home in black stories and black voices. You meet my grandmother, you meet my grandfather, you meet the ways in which, like, Morrison and Bell Hooks and James Baldwin and Cone helped me think better about myself and helped me develop a true self-love and self-respect. You meet me going back home, back into my own past, and bringing out these memories of trauma and pain and translating those stories into meaning as I think back on those moments. Then you see and you meet us now in this country in 2020, when you see a young black girl screaming Black Lives Matter, no justice, no peace. And you meet me in my exhaustion, and you meet other people in their exhaustion, but you also meet us where we are fully alive. And when I think about being fully alive and being black and alive, as June Jordan saying, looking back at you, for me, that is home. Home is where my people find themselves and where I take them with me. So it's not necessarily me trying, because even right now, I'm in ministry at Tabernacle Baptist Church in Augusta, Georgia, and indeed it is home right now for me. But it is so much of home, as I think about this church space and even beyond, is made up of the people, and so many of the people that I bring along the way. And even the people that I lost, because even in those losses were lessons. They taught me about myself, the ways in which I failed. They taught me about myself and the ways in which I've matured. And finding home is so much more about that story of the journey rather than the destination that's stagnant.
That is beautiful. I'm curious, as our last question before we open it up to the audience. You talk about, coming out of this white space and then coming to this space where home is this connection to people. And you talk about George Floyd's death, like you just mentioned, and I wrote this down because it was so poignant, and I'm just curious if you can tell us more. But you say the hope was in the struggle, God was in the hope, and these bodies will not always suffer. These bodies will live. So can you tell us what gives you hope following the murder of George Floyd that you didn't have when Trayvon Martin was murdered, when you didn't have when Alton Sterling was murdered, or Philando Castile? What has changed? Is it you or is it the country?
Well, I'm a bit of a pessimist in that regard. I don't think history has given us enough evidence, to say that this country has changed. That yes, things are different, but we got to be honest with ourselves about the language of hope and change. My granddaddy passed away um, a few weeks ago. I think it's a week now, maybe a week and a half, 2 weeks. I don't know. Time is kind of interesting right now. But I thought about my granddaddy's story, and I think about hope a lot. Not right now, but I think about older black people. My granddaddy is a baby, and my grandmother, both of them are babies of the post-war period during the Great Depression. They remember distinctively hearing the words Emmett Till. They distinctively remember the mother Mamie Till. They distinctively remember when Brown versus Board of Education happened and nothing happened. They remember the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. They even have a original copy of the voter registration. They remember the news when Malcolm was murdered. They remember the news when Martin was murdered. They remember seeing on the screen in the 1970s Vietnam and black soldiers coming back home, giving their lives for this country, and the country giving them nothing in return. They remember the 1990s when Rodney King is beaten in public. They remember the mid-90s when Amadou Diallo. They remember the 2000s. And even to this moment, they are cognizant of George Floyd murdered. And my grandmother remembers when Breonna Taylor is murdered. Emmett Till's name is remembered. So is Breonna Taylor. And we got to rethink. For me, I started to think like, okay, we got to rethink this language of hope. I was sitting down with one of my granddaddy's best friends, Mr. Charles Earl. And he tells me, he's talking to me, he's leaning over, and he has my hand in his hand. And he tells me, he says, this is one of the things I'm going to miss so much about your granddaddy. Where we just been able to talk. I'm going to miss us being able to talk. And he says, have you ever been on a cruise? I said, nah, Mr. Earl, I haven't been on a cruise. He said, I've been on a cruise. And he says, this is what I do when I go on a cruise. He says, whenever we stop, I always stop and look at the water. I say, why, Mr. Earl? Why you look at the water? You're on a cruise. You should be enjoying all the free food, and the views and all of these things. He says, I stop and look at the water. He says, the reason why I stop and look at the water is this. He says, because somebody died there. Somebody swam there. And he says, when you look at yourself, you're only here because somebody survived the swim. And he tells us, I say, oh, that sounds, you're right, Mr. Earl. And he says, he said, people talk about the greatest generation, right, as the post-war generation. And people say, that's the greatest generation. He says, you know who the greatest generation to me is? I say, who, Mr. Earl? He said, the greatest generation is every black person who survived the voyage. So how do you think about hope when they have those memories of surviving the voyage? For me, as I think about that, and I think about my granddaddy, how he died without ever having received the fullness of the promise of his citizenship. When I think about all the black folk who died and lived in the midst of this tragic circumstances, and so many of the stories that we do not have, for me, hope is not within this kind of abstract principle. It ain't in no doctrine. It ain't in even the ability to pray myself through things. For me, the hope is in their being alive. For if they can live, then I can as well. And Baldwin has this interesting quote that I absolutely love. He says, "Here you were to be loved, baby, to forever strengthen you against a loveless world. He says, if we had not loved one another, none of us would have survived. So when I think about hope, I don't know if I have the hope that I used to, that things will change. You know, I was oblivious when Trayvon was murdered, but I was woken up when Philando and Alton was murdered. But even being aware of blackness and the precarious nature that this country deals with our bodies, the ways in which we, even in these moments, like we can celebrate the progress, but then you mourn the losses that we continue to face. I look at us and I say, I want to find love and hope in our living. That the glory of God is black people alive, creating life, falling in love, failing, getting better, changing things, creating beauty. Whatever we do to make sure that our children and their children inherit something better than what we were given, for me, that is hope. And it won't protect us, but it does keep us in touch with our humanity.
Thank you. That is, a beautiful sentiment, right?
I'm sorry to be so pessimistic.
I mean, but it is a part of what happens when you live in a loveless country, as you said. So thank you for sharing that. I mean, black life is what is the hope, right? That is like carrying on this black life, this continuation of culture that just brings the world so much. Like that, that's a beautiful picture of hope. So thank you for sharing that with us. So I want to open it up to the audience now. I know we only have a little bit of time left, but if we have questions, I'd want to open that up. Please raise your hand. We have a microphone out in the stand, so if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand.
Thank you so much for taking this time to meet with us. And I know, at least as I was invited, that many of the individuals who are here in person, and maybe by Zoom as well today, are representing different faith communities. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that jumped out at me in your story is the fact that while you and your family of origin for a time defined and centered your family's life around faith communities that were not rooted in the black community, that the continuity was having a strong attachment to a faith community, and then for you, the journey that continued from there, that was your own journey to define, was making your faith community one that also connected back then to the black community. And it occurs to me that there's another story that a man of our generation and your generation could tell within the black community, which is of a family that remained strongly attached and rooted to a black community that at some point in its history was strongly rooted in a black church, but that while they remained tied to a black community, the ties to a church, to any organized faith organization, fell away as they moved on through their generations and their immersion in a larger world. And I think that is a trajectory that many of our communities face, that a lot of the faith communities in this country are rooted in both a religious tradition and in an ethnic, cultural, national heritage tradition, and that while individuals retain a bond to that latter element, that in an increasingly secular society, the first piece of it falls away, and I think to the detriment of not only those individuals and to the churches, but to the society at large. And so I'm wondering what you have to say to individuals who have remained rooted in a black community, but don't see the relevance of a black church to that identity and to that community, since you wed the two and are struggling to build that unified tradition.
Good question. So for me, I don't think that even though I am a minister within the black church and in the black church tradition, I don't think that that one you know needs to be rooted to an institution to hold up a tradition. You know, of course, traditions and institutions are bound together and woven together. But I do think that in our history, particularly Black history, the Black church is almost, you know, it has been a powerful space and a continued space for continued conversation. But also, I do think that there is the possibility of, you know, the Black church being an expansive idea beyond just simply the physical building or the institution, to thinking about Black faith as a general reality. And so, even when we think about Black Lives Matter movement, when Black Lives Matter movement is happening, so much of, you know, so much of the places that it's happening is within the church and outside of the church, and neither took away from the movement for Black lives. And so I don't want to say that like one needs the church in order for, blackness to be what it is, nor does one not need the church. I think, we have found ways, even those who have left the physical and institutional church have found ways to embody faith, even as they show a commitment to Black people. And I think there needs to be a better synergism or continued synergism between actual Black churches, and Black people, or black faith in general. So I hope I'm answering that as best I can. I just want to get away from the idea, this kind of idea that like justice won't happen, community won't happen unless we have a strong Black church, or that history is like the Black church has always been this space of like liberation, or things like that. I think for us who are inside of the Black church, if we're honest, if you're Black straight male, then Black church experience may be that for you, a space of liberation. But oftentimes, if you're a Black woman, if you're Black LGBTQ, then the Black church is a little bit more complicated conversation, um, especially when you're talking about that conversation being in public, where I'm even thinking in certain court cases where Black churches and white churches would basically vote the same in certain court cases, in certain situations. And so I think I personally have been wanting, even as I am rooted in the Black church, and I love the Black church, and I'm very much Black church and very churchy. I personally want to say that weaving Black faith and Black life together is a meaningful reality, but it is not the only reality. And when we think about like how we work together, I think there needs to be the possibility of us existing in multiple spaces, without thinking about our future only, or our past. Our future or our past is only linked to one type of space, if that makes sense. I don't know if it makes sense at all.
I guess I just want to give a little bit of background, and I try not to talk too long. Um, but I had the fortune of studying with James Cone, Cornell West, James Forbes, and did I say James Washington? And of those four, James Washington knew about that space in the Black church, which was not available to women or to people who of different LGBTQ. And as a person on the faculty at Union Seminary, opened those spaces to us by his presence. Unfortunately, he died at about 50 or younger. But what being in that space with those teachers, and they're all Black men, taught me was that there was a quality of wonder, so that even when I made an uppity white comment to correct something that was factually in error that James Cone said, he could come back at me and say, "You're right." And then I worked as his secretary for
great question. I lean on Katie Cannon in this, and she talked about power dynamics. I'm thinking even with Audre Lorde, where she says in her essay, The Transformation of Silence into Language, she says that there are so many silences to be broken. She says that it is not our differences that destroys us, but our silence. So I think for us to be able to dwell together in community, we have to ask ourselves, where are those silences? Because those silences are always bound to power. And whose voice is able to be heard, whose voice is not able to be heard, who gets to talk with no consequence, who gets to talk with consequence, who gets to determine what's like where the direction of whatever we do goes and things like that. So I think as we walk into a space with a certain type of awareness, while also saying, this is who I am, this is what I bring to the table, and I recognize that in others, without thinking about it as being a competition, then I think in some sense, as we think about that awareness of power dynamics, and we think about not just our differences, but also, the things that are wrapped up in keeping us silent about certain things, and we try and work through those again and again and again, and we go through a process of learning and growing and maturation, then over time, we'll realize that we have developed community than just simply being concerned about proximity. And so I think the challenge is that, like, a lot of people are simply concerned with being around one another, rather than living together. It's hard to be around one another. It's much harder to live together as equals. But I think as people of faith, we have to do that hard work, especially if we want to imagine better for ourselves in the spirit of Martin Luther King when he speaks of beloved community. We can't have beloved community if we're just concerned about getting people in the room. We got to be concerned about the conditions where that life takes place. So it's just like in a seminary context where you have different people in a meeting room, but when it comes to making the decisions, like, that narrative is dominated by one main voice. So you got people giving input, but you have one group giving direction. So I think, like, when we get better at that, when we work at that, when we work at trying to meet one another where we are, who we are, without competition, and trying to expand power and expand, who we listen to and how we be together and how we include those voices and those experiences woven into our own voices and experiences, I think, we'll be better over time. I don't think there's a answer for that because, like, whether within any particularities that we have, in some sense, we're always going to bump up against things and people and perspectives that are different. We have to do the hard work of working through those differences in order for us to, I guess, continue want to show up at least. Yeah, yeah, I can take one more. I can take one more. If
And given your answer, the difficulty, and your questions about institutions versus persons, how do you, what you just described would seem to be an occasion where persons who are not, quote, representing institutions can actually engage in some of those relational experiments and activities, whereas the institutions too soon will actually not let that happen.
mm,
How do you, I mean, so pragmatically, what does that mean for moving forward?
I'm gonna be honest, I don't know. I really don't. I'm a student and I'm trying to figure that out in my own life. I just don't know. I just think you try creative things, creative ways for people to get around one another, to be aware of power dynamics and be aware of, our actions and what those actions do and how it makes people feel. And we try and listen to those hurts and do something about it. I think if institutions, those who are given decision-making authority, and those who are living within these institutions, as we do a better job at that, I hope, I pray that something better can be achieved. But honestly, But the best answer is I don't know.
That is our time. So thank you so much to those who are here in the room with us, and to those who are watching online. And thank you again so much, Dante,
Thank you.
for sharing with us. It was very informative, and I hope everyone gets an opportunity to read your book and hear how you embrace this idea of rage, love, and how we move forward as a people. So thank you.
Yeah, indeed. And thank y'all.